She sat in the corner of the abandoned house, trembling from the cold and hunger. Suddenly, footsteps echoed, close, unsettling. His voice, "Are you here?" made her freeze. Everything she had taught herself in solitude no longer mattered, but she still took a step. What happened next changed everything. The air was thick with a biting cold that pierced to the bone. The little cat pressed itself against the frozen roof, unaware of how long it had been there. Time had lost all meaning. The world around her was alien, ruthless, and in its cold embrace, she felt no shelter, no peace. Every breath was a struggle, the frigid air stabbing her lungs, forcing them to contract in desperate gasps. Snow fell in heavy flakes, covering the roof in thick layers. The wind howled, tearing at her fragile body, draining her of what little strength remained, but the cat couldn't move. Her paws, frozen in the snow, felt as though they were made of stone. She tried to find a more comfortable position, but the roof was too slippery, and every movement threatened to send her plummeting to the ground below. The little cat's eyes, filled with fear and pain, watched the dark horizon where the distant city lights flickered faintly. But for her, that world no longer existed. She had lost everything that once meant something. Her home, her family, the warm spot by the fireplace. Everything was consumed by fire. That terrible, cursed fire that devoured everything. Everything she once knew had vanished in the flames. And now, here she was, alone on this roof, with hunger and fear as her only companions. A deep ache gnawed at her small chest. How long had it been since she last felt peace? Loneliness had become her only companion. There were no more owners to caress her, no hand to reach out for her. Only cold, despair, and emptiness. All her days had turned gray, and every moment stretched endlessly. It was as if she had been forgotten by the world, like an old, useless object discarded and left to fate. Her little paws cracked from the cold. Every movement took tremendous effort. She could barely feel her toes. They had become numb, as though they no longer existed. Her body was filled with pain and exhaustion, and all she wanted was to close her eyes and never wake up again. But she couldn't allow herself that. Not now. She knew that if she closed her eyes, she might never open them again, and that was terrifying. She heard the snow creaking softly under her paws, the wind whistling through the empty spaces, and the silence pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Every moment was torture. But what was worse was that she had no idea how much longer this night would last, how much longer she would have to sit on this roof, surrounded by cold and solitude. Sometimes it felt like the world had frozen, and everything around her was nothing but darkness, swallowing all life. As though she herself had become part of that darkness, vanished and unseen. Her hunger grew stronger, and she sniffed nervously, trying to catch the scent of food, but all she could smell was snow and cold. Her stomach ached, pulling at the emptiness inside. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten, but every spasm in her stomach shot through her with sharp pain, making her want to cry out. But she couldn't. It was too cold, and her weak voice couldn't cut through the howling wind. With each passing moment, the cat lost more hope. She couldn't understand why she should continue, why fight for life, if that life was nothing but a string of pain and fear. Why hadn't she been allowed to simply slip away, to forget this world that had given her nothing but sorrow? The nights had become her hell. She sat in the dark, hidden from all, wondering if being alive was even important. Perhaps it would be better to stop fighting and simply surrender to the endless cold, to the loneliness. But instinct, though tired, had not yet abandoned her. She couldn't give up hope, even if that hope was only a faint, barely visible spark. She couldn't stop believing that somewhere, out there in this vast world, there was something waiting for her. Perhaps a person who would offer her food. Perhaps even just a little warmth. But that spark of hope was growing weaker, just as her strength was. She couldn't believe that her life would change again. Her heart was full of too many wounds, too much pain. But deep inside, the cat knew. If she didn't move, she would die. And then, at that moment, when she was about to give in, when she felt she could no longer move, she suddenly heard a sound. It was something strange. Footsteps. Quiet, cautious steps. Someone was walking through the snow, approaching the roof. The cat froze, listening intently. She couldn't believe that someone could be nearby. The steps grew louder, and the cat felt her heart tighten with fear. Someone was close. A person? Or something else? She huddled closer, as if trying to disappear into the darkness, not drawing attention to herself. But the footsteps didn't stop. It was a living person, and their steps sounded as if they knew where they were going. Every second felt like an eternity. The cat's heart was pounding in her chest, but she couldn't move. She had been alone for so long that she couldn't believe in good intentions. She gritted her teeth, ready for disappointment, ready to face a person who would be as foreign to her as everyone else, someone whose footsteps would only lead to another letdown. But this person didn't hurry. They weren't shouting or running. They just walked, and the cat could feel their presence filling the space around her, creating a new, unfamiliar scent. It was the scent of something different. Perhaps hope. The cold, like an unyielding beast, sank its sharp teeth into her body. Each breath brought pain, as though her lungs were shattering into pieces. The cat could no longer remain on the roof. Her weak body could no longer fight against the icy weight pressing down on her. But where could she go? The world around her was as empty as her own soul. Consumed by the shadow of night, it stood relentless and endless, offering no comfort, no warmth. She slipped off the roof, struggling to stay on her feet as if every step was her last. The snow burned her paws, which felt almost numb. Every movement was heavy, as though she were dragging a chain attached to her body. Only the cold winds continued to drive her forward, piercing her to the bone with each passing moment, stealing her last bit of strength. In the streets, through dark alleys and between abandoned buildings, the cat trudged through the snow. From time to time, her gaze lingered on empty windows, devoid of light and life. She tried to remember the last time she was safe, warm, with someone who loved her. But the memories, like everything that once belonged to her, had faded, melted, disappeared. And now, all that remained was this night, this endless winter, greedily consuming her last reserves of energy. Her body slid across the snow-covered street, each movement growing more exhausting. She didn't know where to go. The maps in her memory no longer worked. Each new step was a step into the unknown. She no longer tried to understand what would happen next because she knew. It didn't matter where she went. With each step, she became more lost. Darkness surrounded her, and the only thing that could save her now was finding shelter, a place where, even for a moment, she could hide from the abyss. She spotted a dark shape at the end of the street, a small, half-destroyed building. Its windows were covered with dirty curtains, and the roof looked as though it might collapse at any moment. But it was her chance, her only hope for respite. The little cat, hardly feeling her paws, made her way toward the building, with each step tightening the tension in her chest. She couldn't understand what had drawn her to this place. Perhaps it was just the desperate desire to find some corner that could shelter her from death, or maybe it was pure chance, but she felt that this was her only choice. As she approached the entrance, she froze. It was eerily quiet. Only her breath disturbed the silence, ringing in her ears. She wanted to believe that this place would be safe, but her instincts wouldn't allow it. She listened intently but heard nothing, except the cold wind. She felt how fear tightened her chest, how her body fought against the urge to rush into the refuge and never leave it. With great effort, trying to make no sound, the cat sneaked through the door. Inside it was dark and cold, but at least there was no snow or wind. In the silent darkness, she felt a momentary sense of relief. But this relief was deceiving. It was just as empty as everywhere else. The same fear, the same empty walls, the same horror that she carried inside. She glanced around, pressing herself against the cold wall, her eyes scanning the dark corners, trying to catch any sign of life. Everything was abandoned. Empty cans, broken bottles, and a heavy, rotten smell. How many days, months, or years had it been since anyone was here? This thought made her heart tighten even more. Her strength was waning, and she could no longer find any assurance, even in this small refuge. She noticed a small alcove in the corner, covered with cardboard and old rags. It was the only place she could hide from the cold. Taking a deep breath, she moved toward it, trying not to think about the surroundings. The cursed solitude swallowed her once again. Nestled in that dark niche, the cat curled up into a tight ball, trying to forget the world around her. This was all she could do. Dark thoughts began to fill her mind once more, but her body was too exhausted to fight them. She tried not to think about how long she would remain here. Her gaze drifted to the corner, where an old piece of graffiti was drawn on the wall, a vague silhouette left by someone long ago. That strange mark reminded her that everything had once been, that someone had lived here, tried to be happy, hoped. But all that was gone. Everything was gone, and she was left alone. And then, in the deepest silence, at the moment when she could hold on no longer, when her body had become so fragile and helpless, the cat felt her eyes begin to close heavily. Sleep was the only refuge she could escape to, if only for a moment, to forget. But even in this sleep, her consciousness remained sharply aware that there was no salvation. She could no longer leave. She could no longer be alive. With each passing moment, her body was more consumed by fatigue, and this corner in the ruined building became her last shelter. The little cat woke up with a strange sensation. At first she didn't understand what had happened. It was hard to tell where she was, but the moment her eyes slowly opened, she felt the cold, sliding wind penetrate her body, making her shrink back once again. Somewhere in the distance, a storm raged, but the sounds were unfamiliar. Something had changed, and something about this change stirred not only fear, but also a strange, undefined anxiety. A pause, almost imperceptible, yet palpable. This was the moment when the cat realized she was not alone. She strained her ears, trying to catch any unfamiliar sounds. Every nerve was on edge. The darkness in the corner where she lay grew even thicker, and the air seemed lighter, despite the cold. Somewhere far off, in the empty corridor of the old abandoned building, she heard cautious footsteps. Gradually, they grew louder, like the booming, ringing beat of a heart that began to drown out her own. At first, panic gripped her. The cold had almost completely seized her body, and instinctively, she trembled. Panic. So familiar, so terrifying, the kind that had haunted her since those days when she was thrown out into the streets. The fear of betrayal, the fear of pain, the fear of loneliness. She knew better than to trust, that this world had always been foreign to her, that each step was a harbinger of pain. But these footsteps, they were different from all she had ever known. These steps carried an odd calmness, a kind of bewildered presence that made her shrink further into the dark corner. Her heart raced faster as though it were trying to leap out of her chest. The sound of footsteps grew louder. With each passing second, as though her life depended on this sound, her fear grew, mingling with that strange sensation she could not ignore. A fleeting thought flashed through her mind. What if it's someone dangerous? But what if it was someone who could help? She pushed this thought away like an unwelcome guest. Her entire being resisted this possibility, for she could not allow herself to hope again. Hope, for her, was nothing but weakness, betrayal of her own heart. But fear was real. The footsteps grew too distinct, and the cat, unable to hold back a shudder, suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of losing control. She tried to stand, but her body refused to obey. The fatigue and pain that had accumulated over so many long days kept her captive. Her paws ached, her belly twisted with hunger, and her heart tightened with uncertainty. She felt that old familiar chill of loneliness. It was as though everything she had endured distilled into a single, unbearable truth. She was alone. And in that moment, when she felt her soul once more overwhelmed by the cold, the footsteps suddenly stopped. A moment. Complete silence. No sounds. Only her trembling paws, her uneven breath, breaking the hollow quiet. She knew he was nearby. This person. He stood still, unmoving. But how could she trust him? How could she trust anyone when life had so cruelly deceived her? But what if this was the chance? What if the last hope she held, hidden beneath this cold layer of fear, would finally take shape? And then, almost as if answering her silent question, a soft voice broke the stillness. It was gentle, almost whispering, yet there was no threat in it. It was simply a word. "Are you here?" he asked, and in his voice was something that made the cat freeze. This was not just an ordinary question. It was a question full of caution and concern. And in that question, there was more love than she had ever felt in her life. That simple phrase was like a breath of air to her, but at the same time, it struck her wounded heart like a blow. She froze. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even answer. How could she trust this person? How could she believe that his words weren't empty, that there was no trickery in them? He could be the one who betrayed her, like so many others had done before. But what if this voice, this was the chance that would never come again? What if his care was the only thing she would ever have? She felt her heart begin to shift. No, she wasn't ready to fully trust. No, she couldn't just throw herself into the arms of a stranger, for his hands might be the ones to take everything from her. But at the same time, something in her soul reached out to this voice, reached out to the light he carried with him, despite all her pain. With trembling paws, the cat slowly began to move. Every motion took immense effort, as if she were fighting herself. Fear, like a shadow, followed every step she took. But that strange, almost imperceptible hope, however vague, lifted her. She couldn't explain what had happened, but each step she took was a step toward life, a step toward believing again. When she reached his feet, when she sat beside him, barely touching his shoes, the cat felt her heart fill once more with pain. But not only pain, something else, something new. It was fear, but also hope, all at once. She could feel her body shake, unable to deal with the emotions, the new sensation, with this person so close. He didn't touch her. He simply stood there, as though understanding how terrified she was. And that gesture, that quiet, invisible act, meant more to her than 1,000 words. In that moment, she understood. She wasn't ready, but she was ready to try. Not to trust completely, not to open up immediately, but to believe in a chance. This chance for salvation, for a future, however uncertain. And that was enough. And several days had passed since the cat first stepped into the threshold of the new world, a world that felt foreign and incomprehensible. It wrapped around her with its coldness, but still, there was something in this place that kept her from leaving. The man, the one who had unexpectedly entered her life, didn't know that every gesture of his was not just kindness to the cat, but a true salvation, that every glance he gave her was a chance to survive. This time, she lay again in the corner. He, quiet and calm, warmed the small space with his hands, with his presence. She no longer felt fear, but her soul remained on guard, like a wound that could never be forgotten. She couldn't shake the thought that if she allowed herself to relax, if she opened up and let that tiny, vague hope grow in her chest, she would lose everything again. And in that moment, something heavy, like an impenetrable cloud, hovered over her soul. But it was unbearable to stay in that corner. Her eyes searched again for something that might be her salvation. At that moment, he approached her, cautiously, as if he knew her heart was fragile, like old glass ready to shatter. She felt his hands, rough yet warm. He bent down and slowly offered her food, a small but precious hope. She didn't take it right away. It felt so unfamiliar. After everything she had gone through, it was hard to believe this wasn't another trap. But hunger was too great, and his gesture too sincere. With trembling paws, she reached out for the food, pausing for a moment before taking it in. The first bite she swallowed was not just food. It was a return to life. It was a feeling she had almost lost when she had been cast out onto the streets. It was the moment when she realized she could be more than just a survivor. She could be alive, feel, experience, and, perhaps, hope again. Everything she felt was like a storm inside, a mixture of fear and gratitude. But it wasn't simple. She was ready to believe in the warmth, but it was so little. A cold emptiness still remained in her chest. She couldn't forget everything she had been through, the loss, the loneliness, the pain. It all lingered inside her like old, crusted wounds that could never fully heal. She looked at him as he sat next to her, leaning against the wall, watching her. He didn't expect recognition from her, didn't demand anything. He simply sat there, quietly, as though understanding that she needed his presence more than any words. And it was in this moment, when the silence around her seemed so heavy that even breathing was audible, that the cat felt something shift inside her. Her small, tired heart took a step forward, as though it had decided, for the first time, to leave the dark, cold cave where it had hidden for so long. She didn't know what would happen next, but something in this gesture, in this small act of kindness, became her first step toward healing. Days passed. The cat slowly began to adjust to the warmth that filled the room. But every morning, she woke up with pain. The pain wasn't physical. It was in her soul. And she knew that time heals, but wounds never fully close. She couldn't forget how she had been thrown away, how her world had burned, how her heart had been torn apart by loss. And these scars were so deep that every day they reminded her of their presence. But she couldn't stop. She knew that, despite the pain, she could keep moving forward. With each day, the cat grew a little bolder. She began to trust the man. He didn't demand love from her, didn't force her to open up immediately. He simply was there, giving her space and time, allowing her to find her way in this new world. She understood that his care wasn't fleeting, that it wasn't forced. It was real warmth. With him, She felt that it was possible to move forward, that even the deepest wounds could heal. But one day, when the cat woke up in the morning and felt that her world had become a little brighter, a little warmer, her gaze lingered on one spot, on her paws. She noticed they weren't trembling as much from the cold, that her body didn't ache as much as it had before. She took a step, another one, and another. It was difficult, it was painful, but she was walking again. At some point her gaze fell on the window. Outside there was fog, but through it the sun was breaking through. It wasn't just the sun, it was something more. It was hope. She couldn't help but notice how the world around her, despite everything that had happened to her, continued to exist. It was. Everything was. It was a quiet reminder that life, despite everything, was worth fighting for. She felt something stir inside her, as though she was filling with new strength. He had given her a chance. He had given her time. He had given her the opportunity to believe that the world could be good. She couldn't be sure of the future, but something in her soul was no longer empty. When he approached her, carefully extending his hand, the cat didn't flinch. She couldn't pull away, even if she had wanted to. He reached out to her head and gently stroked her. And in that moment, the cat felt that this gesture was not just a sign of affection. It was confirmation that perhaps she hadn't been forgotten by this world, that perhaps everything she had been through hadn't been in vain. She couldn't forget her past. She couldn't just throw it away. But now she knew one thing. Her future was here, with him, on this path. This was the light that pierced her soul, reminding her that even in the darkest corners, there could be room for love.